All right, well, hello everybody. Welcome. My name is Samantha Blankart, and I am the Early Literacy Outreach Librarian. I work for the Alaska State Library and also at the Anchorage Public Library, and I am the coordinator for Ready to Read Alaska, which is a statewide initiative that teaches caregivers and librarians about the importance of early literacy, and it provides practical ways that caregivers can support their child's early literacy development, whether they're at home or at the library. And today's early literacy chat is on the is how we can engage with parents and caregivers through early literacy tips that we might share at a story time. And the content of today's chat is based on a module from the Supercharged Storytimes for All training that was originally from OCLC and Web Junction. So if you were lucky enough, it was about 2 falls ago now, we had Supercharged Storytimes for All. You may have gone through that. If not, this is a great opportunity to learn something new. All right, let's dive on in. Find my mouse. There we go. Okay. So early literacy development starts at birth. Children are with their at-home caregivers every day, all the time. And these caregivers are a child's first teacher. Children imitate adults and learn from them, and small interactions throughout the day add up to make a really big difference. And so we as librarians can support them. We can help them support their child's language and literacy development. One of the strengths of Storytime is that we are supporting early literacy through enjoyable and fun activities, and we're able to model these kinds of activities for the adults in the room. And it's really important to engage caregivers and to share early literacy information with them, because if a child comes to a story time, or maybe they're watching a story time now online, and then they're at home in an environment that's not very language rich, then that intervention of story time is often not going to be enough to develop a child's early literacy skills. Story times, of course, are very valuable in and of themselves, but to really increase their value, we have to help the adults continue to support early literacy at home as well. And just as with children, adults are more engaged when we are building relationships with them. It's an important and evolving process to build rapport and trust between you and the adult caregivers. So when we listen to parents and caregivers who come to our library, we learn their perspectives and we can find a common ground for sharing experiences and that knowledge back and forth. And so both we and the parents and caregivers can share ideas on ways that we can support that early literacy development at home. The first topic today is about how to offer early literacy tips to show how what we're doing in Storytime supports early literacy and a child's later reading. So if you attended the previous early literacy chat we had about interactivity and intentionality, which was all the way back in April, you may now be noticing connections between books that you're using in Storytime and the different components that make up early literacy. One important benefit of becoming intentional, recognizing the connection between a Storytime activity and a child's later reading ability, is that we can also share this information by adding an early literacy tip for parents and caregivers in our Storytime. So what is an early literacy tip exactly? Simply put, it's just a couple of sentences that explain the connection between what we're doing and how that supports early literacy and how that connects to later reading. This is something that usually only takes about 15 to 20 seconds. It really doesn't take very much time at all. Caregiver evaluations of story times that included early literacy tips found that caregivers are more likely to continue doing early literacy activities at home for 2 reasons. 1, the Storytime presenter made it look fun and doable. And 2, they now understand the connection between the activity and literacy, and that motivates them to keep going. So what might an early literacy tip look like? This image we've got here is from a book that I love and that my almost 3-year-old loves. It's Tea Party Rules by, I think it's Amy Dykman. I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce it. So on this page, um, we're seeing the girl, she carries this bear cub outside and they found the cookies. And if you haven't read this book before, it's a great, this little bear cub finds this plate of cookies out by this house and he really wants them and he has to go through all of these different things in order to try and get to these cookies. The girl says, now the most important tea party rule is you must eat daintily. So this little girl has been coming up with different tea party rules that are preventing him from getting access to these cookies. So if I've just read this page at a story time, I might explain to a group that daintily means to do something very gently or delicately. So if the most important rule is to eat daintily, then Bear needs to eat the cookies gently or delicately. Maybe he needs to take it, small little bites instead of big chomps. And then the tip you can say now to parents and caregivers who are at your story time is to say, when we explain an unfamiliar word, we help children learn what that word means. And this helps them know more words, which will later help them understand what they're reading. So when we say an early literacy tip, we want to connect the dots for caregivers, to walk them between the activity we're doing and then how it supports their child's development. So there's kind of a messy sort of example here, but if we are connecting different activities we're doing, saying like guessing a rhyming word, clapping out syllables, acting out a story, and we're using one of those early literacy practices of reading, singing, playing, talking, writing, we are now connecting that to some of the early literacy components here, and some of them are about decoding the different sounds in a word, or it could be about comprehension, so decoding and comprehension. Again, from our previous early literacy chat, one of the very basic building blocks of how children learn to read. They have to sound out the word, and then they have to know what that word means. And if they can do that, then they can understand what they're reading. Now, tips, of course, for a library story time don't need to get this technical because it can be kind of overwhelming for them to hear something like this, especially if we're just cramming it into like a 30-second blip. But it is, I think, important for librarians to see that this is sort of the underlying structure here. This is the backbone of how we're helping to prepare children to learn to read. So you, as a professional, may know that having children clap out syllables in words supports their phonological awareness. And that, as you can see here on this little chart, is something that can help children learn to decode words. And so a tip related to phonological awareness could be something like, when we clap out the syllables, it helps children hear the smaller sounds in words, which later helps them sound out words when they learn to read. Another example could be if you have read a factual book, a nonfiction book, maybe even just a couple of pages out of that nonfiction book. You could then say to the adults, when we share factual information with children, they're learning about the world. This builds their background knowledge, which will later help them understand what they will read. Some people can be, I've seen they've been concerned about sounding condescending when they're doing an early literacy tip. But instead of thinking of yourself as like the sage on stage or the person who's the all-knowing, you know everything about early literacy for children, and they should believe you that way, think of yourself more as being a guide or someone who's just helping them figure it out, and maybe you're walking along with them instead of telling them what to do. You're just, hey, I found this cool fact and I would love to share it with everyone because I'm really passionate about this. And so you can try this when we format instead to sort of include yourself in a group to keep it more equal. So like, for instance, we've got here, when we do this activity, we're helping children, explain some kind of skill, and then this is going to help them do blank when they learn how to read. And as you become more intentional, it becomes more easy to articulate the connections for the adults. It might take some time before you feel comfortable sharing your early literacy knowledge with parents and caregivers. And it's okay to start with what feels natural and doable and keep building to tips that are more detailed, making these connections for adults between those behaviors, for early literacy behaviors, and then for their later reading ability. Adding of these tips does not have to take away from the enjoyment of sharing books and different language activities, but instead, it's going to help you enhance that storytime experience. And you can deliver these tips at many different points in your storytime. At the beginning of the storytime, you can choose to briefly explain to the adults what early literacy component that we're focusing on during that storytime and what kind of things to listen for. When you demonstrate an example of something during a storytime, you're talking directly to adults about what thing you just did. You're demonstrating. And at the end of a story time, you can offer ideas for parents and caregivers to empower them to keep early literacy activities going at home after the story time's over. And now you don't want to overwhelm adults with early literacy information, so it's not necessary to do all three of these different types of tips in the same story time. You can, of course, give more than one tip in a story time. It's totally up to you and your own personal flavor. But if you are giving more than one tip, I would suggest that they all be around that same early literacy component. So if you've started your day talking about vocabulary, keep doing tips related to vocabulary. I wouldn't try to switch it up to different things because it might get kind of confusing. All right. So here's just a couple of more examples here to help you get the feel for it. So this is an explanation type tip, which would come at the beginning of a story time. So maybe the next book we're going to be sharing is going to be Mouse Shapes. So we could say, grown-ups, our next book is Mouse Shapes. I'll be taking some time to talk about the shapes that are in these pictures. Talking about shapes helps children to recognize their letters because when they learn to read, children learn to identify letters by their shapes. Something pretty simple there. We might have an example tip in the middle of story time. This one involves a flannel board activity, and I'm not sure how we can ever adapt flannel board activities to be virtual, but in the beautiful future, when we have everyone back in our buildings, if we're doing a flannel board, it's in the middle of our story time. Let's say I've put up these two circles on our flannel board, and each child in the audience gets to have their very own triangle. And we could invite them up to place their triangle somewhere on the board. And the point of this activity is for different spatial relationships. So as a child's putting it on the flannel board, we describe where it is. Oh, Aurelia, you put your yellow triangle between the two circles. Oh, Christopher, I see you've put the pink triangle below the green circle. And so as children are coming up to do the flannel board, then you can look out and talk to the caregivers, and you could say something like, grown-ups, when we talk about words for spatial relationships like between, below, above, we're building children's vocabulary and helping them to learn these concepts, and this will help them later understand what they read. An empowerment kind of tip. This is again something that you can have people do when they are going to be at home. So this is something you would do at the end of story time. And so this one is around the book Blue Sea by Robert Kalin. And this one would be about retelling stories at home. So if we've just finished the book, we can say to the adults, grown-ups, I have a handout here for Blue Sea. You can color and cut out the fish and retell this story at home. Retelling stories helps children understand how stories work, which will later help them understand what they read. So whether you are brand new to doing a story time or if you're a seasoned story time provider, again, you may still feel a bit hesitant about sharing an early literacy tip with the caregivers in the room. However you're feeling about it right now, I've been there and it's totally okay. This type of sharing of tips can take a couple of tries, before you really feel comfortable doing it. And some ways that can help you prepare would be to plan that tip out in advance. You can write the tip down, practice saying it out loud alone or with a colleague, and then do any rewrites as necessary to make it more conversational or have it flow better. And you don't have to say them exactly in the style that I've been saying them. Again, it's just kind of what works for you. Everyone has their own way of communicating, but the important thing is to make sure that you are connecting those dots. I personally like to write out a little shorthand version of them on a sticky note and put them in the book or on the activity I plan to share so that I don't forget them. Because sometimes, you could be in the heat of the moment and you're having so much fun and you've forgotten that extra little thing. So I like to do that. But again, you do you. Another way to provide a tip and to take some of the pressure off of being an expert is to couch it as a fun fact and maybe share it during a transition. Like, hey, fun fact, grown-ups, did you know that? And then share your tip that way. You can also use routine to help you share early literacy tips as well. You could have some kind of signal to the group, so you sing a certain song, and after that song, you have a tip. Or maybe you have a basket or a jar where the tip of the day, you can pull it out and read it together. You could even have, if you do puppets, you can even have a host puppet. And then that puppet can be the person who's sharing the tip with people. And that works really well if you already have puppets in your story time that might introduce story time. We use them sometimes at Anchorage Public Library just to say hello to all the kids and do the welcome song with the puppet. So that might be something to use. You can also just have the tip available in your storytime space, maybe on a whiteboard or one of those big flip charts or huge sticky note pads, and just written out so that caregivers can just read it during storytime on their own. Or you can have tips on a handout that you pass out at the end of your story time with other suggestions for activities as well. And now remember, totally normal for it to take a while to feel comfortable sharing early literacy tips. It's fine to just start with one tip at a story time, and as you become more intentional, it's going to be easier to add more and to articulate these different connections between early literacy practices and later reading skills. You may also feel that some parents and caregivers who are attending your story times, they already know all this information. So why would I bother, highlighting it extra and sharing it? Because, you never really do know. Some parents and caregivers, they might already know that information, but some of them might be brand new and they don't already know that. So, if somebody already knew the information in your tip, they just feel good. It's a little pat on the back for them. Yay, I'm already doing something great for my kid. And if it's not, then they realize, hey, the library is actually a great place to come for new information to help me support my child. So as we become more interactive and as we share information with caregivers, the role shifts from being an entertainer to being a facilitator. Now, of course, that doesn't mean we can't have fun and be entertaining. We're emphasizing that there's joy in books. Reading and language are great and they're fun and you can have fun doing them. It doesn't have to be a chore. We're not trying to replicate any kind of formal learning environment. We're not trying to turn the library storytime into school. But instead, we want to just show that storytime can support a child's early literacy development through joyful activities and informal learning. So now let's look at some ways we can encourage parents and caregivers to interact with their children during story time. So before we were just talking about tips and things we were just saying. And now we can chat about some things that you can actually do. Now, again, if you are doing a virtual story time, this can look different. Most of the examples I'm going to be showing do kind of rely on having people in the room with you, but they could be adapted. I haven't done the adaptation in this presentation yet, but it is possible to adapt some of these things for virtual story time. So increasing the participation of caregivers with their children is going to increase the likelihood that they're going to be continuing these activities to support early literacy at home. It sends a signal to the caregiver that story time is important and it's worth engaging in. It can help a child focus also. And caregivers they're going to be more likely to do an activity at home if they've done that activity before in a story time with somebody showing them how it works. So some simple ways to increase interactivity would be very simple, having name tags for people. If you're giving name tags to children, you can have name tags for the adults. It allows people to meet and to talk to their neighbor. You can also give adults a specific role to play. This is most easily done if you're doing a baby or a young toddler story time, because adults need to be involved because children can't do all the activities on their own. So in like a baby story time, for instance, we're giving instructions to adults on what to do with their children as we're doing like an action song or a bouncing rhyme. In story times for older children, we can still ask caregivers to participate. Maybe we have grown-ups repeat a certain word or phrase and have the children repeat a different one. Some other ideas would be doing a talk time around some kind of theme where we can have caregiver and child share in pairs. We can encourage the adult to ask their children open-ended questions around some sort of theme that we're doing, and allow them time to talk and have that back and forth interaction as well. I've also seen some they call read together time. So instead of just having the librarian up front reading the book, you can actually pass out books to each caregiver and their child or children, and it's a special dedicated time in your story time where the caregiver is reading a book to their child. And if you decide to do something like that, it would be helpful to give adults tips on ways to share books that encourage their child's involvement, such as relating what's happening in the book to a child's experiences, asking open-ended questions, talking about illustrations, things like that. And if you're doing a story time and you're asking a question of the whole group and you're finding that adults are responding before the children have time to respond, you can just ask separate questions. So this is a question for the adults. This is a question for the children. And then the last would be having some kind of craft or activity time near the end of your story time. It's a great opportunity for working cooperatively, for having conversations and asking open-ended questions and really encouraging that back and forth interaction between child and caregiver. All right, so talking is of course a fantastic and very easy way for people to be interactive with their children. And we can encourage the caregiver and child to strive for 5. And that means having 5 back and forth interactions between adult and child. If you want more information about Strive for 5, I do have a video all about it on the Ready to Read Alaska YouTube channel, which is linked on my website, readytoreadak.org, and on all my social media, which is at readytoreadak. So I have a bunch of videos there if you're interested, but there is one specifically for Strive for 5. And so again, like I said, we can encourage families to do a talk time in the story time, or maybe after we have read a book, such as this 2 here on the slide, which deal with fears and things that could be kind of scary. We can have the child sit with their grown-up and talk about things that are scary and have the adult and child share different solutions for how to fend off those fears. And we can also choose books that encourage interactivity as well, something like Jump Frog Jump by Robert Kalin. So in this book, the phrase jump frog jump is repeated. Another repeated phrase is, how did the frog get away? And you can actually ask adults to say, how did the frog get away? And then the children can then jump in and say, jump frog jump. And so that's makes it more of a dialogue between the caregiver and child. We can choose books that have a call and response with lots of repetition. So in the middle here, we have The Cow Loves Cookies by Carmel Wilson. So you might have the grown-ups say the phrase, the cow loves, and then kids can complete the phrase by saying cookies. Another example up here is the book Leapfrog by Jane Clark. And yes, I know I have 2 frog books, but as I've mentioned, I have a almost 3-year-old boy, and so frogs are in right now. And what I like about this one is that in the text, they already have questions to encourage children to look for something that's in the pictures, to listen out for different sounds, and they even participate with counting and other kinds of actions. Plus, you get to learn facts about different jungle creatures, so that's pretty cool too. Singing allows for plenty of interactivity as well, so everyone can sing together and learn new songs to share at home. There are lots of songs that use different hand movements or rhythm sticks or even whole body action. The example song we have up here is one that uses rhythm sticks. I learned it from Jaybrary. So if you haven't heard about Jaybrary before, it's jaybrary.com, and it's a website with different Storytime tips and songs, and it's created by 2 children's librarians from BC, Canada. So this one, they use the rhythm sticks to make the tick-tock and the knocking sounds in the rhyme, and then they use the sticks to sort of mimic the shape of the animal. So for a cat, they're holding the sticks out to their face like whiskers, or for a bunny, it's the ears, for a duck, it's the beak, the walrus teeth, and then they have the alien kind of like antenna. That's pretty cute. I like that one. And then the last one we have here are about intentional activities. So I guess the non-book, non-music parts of a story time. Crafts are pretty popular examples of this. So again, it's hard to do crafts, of course, when you are doing it virtually. But when crafting and all that stuff is available again, make sure that if you're doing something like this, you have enough supplies for both the adults and the children as well. And that's because of perfection and that interaction. So someone might make a mistake and they want to start over and replace a piece. But also having enough materials lets the adults participate as well. And so they can make their own alongside their kids. As you look for ways to support interactivity between adults and their children, you might find that a craft time morphs into more of an activity time. So you could play Simon Says using actions from a book that you've read, or have the adults and children act out a story in a rhyme. Or you could focus more on experiences, like having a separate time for playing with blocks or Legos. And those things give a sense of richness, they share a common happening, and they offer opportunities for rich language development as well. So they are still doing something and participating and learning, even if they're not taking home any kind of craft at the end. And you could also provide activities for people to do outside of the library, maybe passing out a little scavenger hunt sheet. Or I have an example here on a slide. It's Nature Bingo. It's one of the weekly youth programs to go that Anchorage Public Library offered this summer, since we weren't doing any summer reading programs in person. So these types of things are something to encourage families to spend time together, talking and learning with each other. So you, as the librarian, are critical in helping parents and caregivers become more aware of ways they can support early literacy and their child's early literacy development. Both explaining the why and how make a difference, and ways to keep it fun are very important in helping children become readers as they grow. I want to thank everybody for coming to this early literacy chat. Again, My name is Samantha Blankart. If you have any questions, I would love to take some now. If you want to contact me later, all of my information's up here on the slide. We will be having another early literacy chat this year. It's going to be in October. It's Wednesday, October 14th, also at 2 o'clock. And the theme will be on assessing storytime practice. So again, if you have any questions, you can either put them in chat right now or you can unmute yourself and I'll take them. I'm not seeing anything. So if anyone was chatting a question, I'm not seeing anything. So yeah, like I said, if you guys have any questions later about this or any other early literacy or story time or play and learn kind of things, anything related to young kiddos at the library, please don't hesitate to give me a phone call or shoot me an email. You can always find me on different social medias. We have Ready to Read Instagram and Facebook as well. And have a great rest of your afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much for coming.